Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. I'm Simon Caudry, and I'm joined this morning in the studio by my co-host Amy Hubble.
Good morning.
How are you, Amy?
I'm doing pretty well.
Excellent. Today's show is going to be a conversation with the Cayman Islands Minister of Finance and Economic Development. And we're going to explore the current economic landscape of the Cayman Islands, learn a little bit about what's going on, and potentially get an insight into the budget process, which is ongoing as we talk. Therefore, without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome the Honourable Minister McTaggart.
Thank you very much to both of you. Pleasure once again to be here with you and to share with you whatever information I can.
Well, as you say, you have been on our show once before, so we obviously didn't ask tough enough questions. We'll make up for it this time. We'll give you the Paxman grilling.
Yeah, the fact that you agreed to come back again tells us that we weren't hard enough on you.
I actually enjoy this stuff.
Right. Well, that's a temptation. You enjoy talking about economics. This is great news. Let's start off then with the state of Cayman's economy, where we are. I mean, a lot of listeners, obviously, everyone lives here in Cayman, or we do have some international listeners, but everyone wants to know what's going on in the Cayman economy. The statistics are dry, and it's difficult to interpret those, they're numbers, but what's your sense as to where we are as an economy then?
Well, my sense is that the economic expansion and growth just continues to roll along. And you look everywhere around you, you see, development taking place. You see and you hear of all the increased numbers in tourism, financial services, and numbers continue to be good. 2018, Simon, was an extraordinary year for the country and for government's finances. We saw revenue growth of somewhere in the region of 15%. For 2019, we're seeing that moderate a bit because I knew that we couldn't repeat that kind of a number, that kind of a growth.
Where was those numbers coming from? Is it a one hit kind of situation, or you just don't think
that
we can
contribute
sustain it?
To a significant degree? You had the overall growth in the economy and the funding that provides, but you had some very large transactions, real estate transactions last year that contributed to the increase in the government's coffers. Mm-hmm. For example, the sale of the West End and the not Comfort Suites, the Sunshine Suites.
Yes.
That was the single largest real estate transaction in the country's history at over 300 million.
Wow.
So, there were some very large, real estate transactions that served to swell the government coffers. The other thing we have is that we every year, we are able to recognize certain revenue from assets that government is able to claim from companies that have gone out of business and left, funds behind.
Yeah, those dormant companies.
Yes, dormant companies, and from there. So every year we get a bit of a boost in those revenues from these sources.
Well, that's a good public service announcement coming up here. If you do have a company and you don't want the government to get its hands on it, then make sure you pay your fees to the government.
Absolutely. Last year we benefited to the tune of somewhat more than $30 million.
$30 million?
Yeah. This year the number drops right down to like 3 or 4 million. So
those are just companies walking away saying,
not necessarily, but yes, certainly in their banking business and other types where they, banks, if they remain dormant for so many years, then the banks are obliged to turn that money over to the government, and it becomes then the property of the financial secretary. And the other thing, we benefited too from some residual funds from the BCCI liquidation which completed many years ago.
Back in the 80s, wasn't it?
Well, that's when it started, but the liquidation wasn't completed until about 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And so there were some residual assets there that were paid into there. So last year, we were able to take that into government revenues.
If we look at government revenues, then the key ones, I suppose, come from the financial services, tourism, healthcare now increasingly, perhaps?
You're starting to see that contribute, to creep up there, but it's still a very minor segment of government revenues. Yes, for certainly financial services, that alone contributes well over $100 million every year to our coffers.
And then what about the tourism market?
Tourism sector, yes, although the percentages I'm not so sure of, but year after year, and over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen annual records being broken in terms of what revenue is contributed to government.
So from your perspective, when you look at Cayman's economy, you're seeing all the areas performing relatively okay.
There isn't a single area that I can see, Simon, that is not performing and contributing in a positive way to government's revenues and to the overall growth of the economy. So, the way I see it is that we're clicking on all cylinders.
And I think when we had you in the studio last time, we talked about the fact that Cayman is in essence, it doesn't always control its own destiny. We're not, from an economics perspective.
Sure.
A lot of what happens here is driven by what goes on elsewhere in the world. And so a lot of what you're talking about, the financial services doing well, tourism doing well, these are functions of the health of the US economy, the health of the European economy, the health of the Asian markets. Yeah. Do you see any issues from your perspective on the horizon? What's your view of whether we're going to be seeing one of these recessions that people keep speculating about?
Yes, well, we're all painfully aware of what is being said and speculated on in international press. And yes, more than 80% of our entire economy takes place with our neighbors to the north. So, and I always say anytime America sneezes, we catch a cold. So I pay very close attention to what I see happening in the United States and the economy there. And in a way to try and see if I can identify, what's likely to transpire. What you are seeing in North America right now, I think, is an economy that is moderating. It is slowing down. GDP growth is now under, I think I saw like some of the first reads on it. That's like at 2%, 1.9%. So, that's a lot.
And it was in the high threes at one point.
It was well over 3. At one quarter, I think you actually had at 4%. There was a 4%. I'm not sure what the final read on it was. So you have a moderating U.S. economy. That tells me that we will start to moderate as well. And in a sense, you are starting to see some of that right now with the revenues not growing as fast as they are, although they are growing at a very healthy rate still. It's not a repeat of 2018 where we were, it was just sort of gangbusters. Mm-hmm. So I do watch the U.S. economy very closely and what's happening there. It is too very much a consumer-driven economy. It's like two-thirds of their economy is consumer-based as well. And, consumer consumption is probably the last thing to go in your economy. Mm-hmm. Once that happens, you basically you're in a recession if you're not close to it.
And I think it's also fair to say that even if tomorrow the US entered a recession, that people will already have made their plans for vacations down here in Cayman 3-6 months ago. Yes. So Cayman's response to what happens in the US is with a lag. So even if we see on the news the US is entering a recession or it's all going terribly wrong, we should be worried, rightly so, but we will have a little bit of time to begin preparation versus what they would see if you're living in the States, because you've got that lag of people visiting here, already running companies. So we've got a little bit of time to prepare should the worst happen, I suppose.
Yeah, and that is correct. We normally focus on somewhere between 6 and 12 months, mm-hmm. with 9 months being the average, as to when we would expect to see any moderation or any contraction in the U.S. start to filter in here. But I think we sort of, in my mind too, because of the robustness too of our construction sector, which too still continues to perform exceedingly well, we probably built in a bit of a resilience into our economy in that a lot of those construction projects will be in progress if we do sort of see the external factors influence. Mm-hmm. We do have some of our own internal factors that I think will tend to mitigate and to moderate any potential effect on Cayman.
Well, and one of the symptoms or side effects, perhaps side effects is a better word, of a robust and growing economy, which people suffer, is the rising level of inflation. The fact that prices in the shops, I'm not going to pick on one supermarket, so Kirk's, Hurley's or Foster's, you go into the shops and price of a pint of milk or whatever it might be always seems to be going up. And that's something which costs people in terms of their pocket. It's real money to people that's going out of the door. How do we deal with that? Is that something we can deal with?
Simon, there is very little. I mean, in fact, I don't have any tools in the chest to deal with inflation other than, government taking a hammer to the whole thing and price controls. It's not an area I would ever want to go down. And the reason
you could eliminate duty, I guess.
Pardon?
You could eliminate the duty on everything.
Duty elimination. Go on.
Look at the import duty schedules, and most foodstuffs are now duty free.
Yeah.
So that, again, I don't even have that tool anymore. So, if what I see now is that the U.S. economy, U.S. inflation is starting to moderate as well, and that is coming down. And I think in time you'll see that filter through. We had a real big spike last year. I think in the summer, inflation was running at an annual clip of about 4.6%. This most recent inflation numbers that we have for the first half of the year show it's running at about 3.4%. So we are seeing a moderation of it. What surprises me about inflation appearing at this point, it's so late in the economic cycle. It's so untypical of an economic cycle to have it appear at this point.
Yeah, it's very odd, and it has a lot to do, I think, with the rest of the monetary situation of the rest of the world, and that the U.S. is able to somehow keep their rates, even drop rates, down and not create inflation, and that would usually not be the case in any way, except for the state that the rest of the world is in and the demand for dollars, and along with the continuation of very low oil and gas prices.
Absolutely.
Which we don't suffer as much as quickly as the U.S. does.
Yes, that's true.
Although lower fuel prices over time should help Cayman's inflation rate because, of course, one of the principal costs of shipping is the cost of fuel and things like that. So that's a really important figure to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, for the most recent consumer price index, I'll give you some of the headline numbers. Should come as no surprise to you. Well, certainly the headline number in this most recent report that will be released, recreation and culture, is up about 11.5%. But the second highest, again, housing and utilities here in Cayman. For the second time, it's over 10%. Yeah. It's now 10.4%. It was like 11, 12% last report.
And how does that compare in the past, I guess, decade?
It's always been an issue when you have a strong economic expansion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the reason is too for us right now is, we're a bit behind the curve in terms of where the demand is and where the supply is. And what is driving this in a very big way for us, apart from the demand increasing, outstripping the supply, you have the double barrel in that a number of people who rent homes and condos and the rental market, people are taking them out of the local market and placing them into Airbnb because they get better returns. I mean, last year, in terms of accommodating of our visitors here in Cayman, about 65% of the increase last year in tourism was accommodated in Airbnb facilities. So that whole area has just exploded for us here in Cayman.
Which is great for those who own the property,
absolutely,
but not for those who are renters, and that's always the...
And they are coming in now, and you hear some of the unheard of rentals that are being demanded, and people are having to pay.
And we shouldn't forget, one of the things that I think a lot of people do struggle with is how expensive rent is. And one of the factors associated with that is the population here in Cayman has expanded dramatically. We're in the, mid-60s now, I think it is.
Actually, I think the numbers are even higher than that.
Right.
I think the numbers are more like around 68,000 right now.
Mm-hmm.
We're growing at about 4 to 5% in our population.
And if you bring in another 1,000 people, if another 1,000 people arrive in a year, it's as much as there is construction going on in Cayman, and as much as it seems as though every inch of this land is being built upon, there's not 1,000 houses going up every year. These complexes are for 100 perhaps, and that's a lot of these things that you need to be building every single year.
We do have several programs that are developments that are going on that I think will add I think it's I can't say whether it's 1,000 or what, but it's going to be many hundreds of accommodation.
So there could be some easing of pressure perhaps on that over the next 12 to 18 months.
I think that there will be. Good. And as the economy continues to moderate as well, that the demand probably will not be as great, but it will still be there. Okay. So I mean, we have that situation where demand just, you'll see a trending of the lines between demand and supply, I think, over time.
A bit of economics there. We're going to take a short break, and we'll come back and continue our conversation with Minister McTaggart on the subject of Cayman Islands economy.
Sign up for the DCFS Universal Children's Day 5K Run Walk and help families in need. Sunday, 24th November, starting 6 a.m. at Dragon Bay Safe Haven. The theme is
I have a voice.
Hear Me Roar. Feel free to wear something on the wild side. Entry fee is only $15 for adults, $5 for children, 16 years old and younger, with t-shirts for the first 75 registrants, with a free raffle for all. Register at caymanactive.com. There will be a special registration day at the Government Administration Building for cash payments on Wednesday, November 20th, between noon and 4 p.m.
Money Sense, the only personal finance radio show in the Cayman Islands, hosted by Simon Caudry from the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
This is Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense and our conversation with Minister Roy McTaggart on the subject of the Cayman Islands' economy and its economic outlook. Just before the break, we talked a little bit about the population, the surge in population that we've experienced. I think during the break you got the statistics out, and it's 68,000 people that are here now living in Cayman.
That's the estimate.
Which seems as though they're all on the bypass at the same time in the mornings, and all certainly coming from East End. But we talked also about housing, as to how these people are actually going to live in Cayman and the cost that means in rent. And you were talking, Amy, I think you mentioned that there are some projects.
Yeah, I'd read that there was some projects going on to kind of alleviate, and especially for specifically Caymanians, and how they will be able to, with some changes in the stamp duty law, as well as some infrastructure investment that the government's doing, start to alleviate some of those problems. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, what we continue to see within the planning department is that a number of private sector projects are continue to flow. The pipeline is healthy. In addition to that, government has some targeted programs in terms of low-cost housing that, to target specific areas of the economic spectrum for us. And, within East End right now, they're constructing some more homes. We still have a little bit of inventory available, but then we're also looking at some fairly significant development of these homes in the Georgetown area off the Linford Pearson Highway. We acquired earlier this year. We acquired about 24 acres of land there, to which over time.
Yeah, I'm driving down there. It feels like there's a different development on both sides all the way down.
No, absolutely, and it's going to develop here very quickly. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's opened. That road has the Linford Pearson Highway has now opened up all of that land to the south of the road to development. And remember too that Enterprise City. Yeah. They're planning an entire city between there and the South Sound community.
There's going to be hundreds of listeners listening to this who are going to be terrified by the number of extra cars that are going to be on that road every morning. So be careful what we wish for.
Well, the Grand Harbor situation is obviously an issue. Talk to us about kind of the priority for infrastructure there.
Well, we are developing and making changes as quickly as we can, but nothing that we do right now, I think, is going to make the problem go away. All we can do is make it a little bit better. There is no question that is the choke point for traffic coming from the east and getting it to town.
Well, there's no way to go around it. It's the only door to the east.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the definition of a roundabout is you do go around it.
But you have to go around it.
Yeah,
it's your only option.
Whether we go over it, around it,
right,
or what.
Walk through it.
It's amazing some of the things that the ideas that are coming forward for consideration, and every one of them, I think, has merit. But I think, as part of the long-term solution is we have to find a way to limit the number of cars coming into the country. Mm-hmm. We can't do it. You look at, coming into work and going out every day. All the cars, and probably 95% of those things have one person in them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think import duty on cars is too low? You look at Singapore, Hong Kong.
It's not too low. I tried to bring my car and I forget about it.
You hear both sides of the argument. I mean, import duties just haven't been touched for probably the better part of 20, 30 years. Yeah. They've been in place like that. But I think what we need to have is a more structured and a better public transport system. Sure. Before you can actually look at doing any of these things to limit the numbers of cars that do come into the island. But to me it's a very multifaceted, and because we just simply cannot continue to build more and more roads. We've got to find other ways and means of providing for.
We're talking
for
here
transportation.
About infrastructure, which is there's two sides to infrastructure. One is the inclination and willingness and capacity. And capacity leads to the ability to spend money on infrastructure.
Yeah.
And with the economy, you talked about how government revenues have been growing substantially. That, in a lot of people's minds, leads them to think, well, if revenue's going so well, why can't you spend the money? So talk us a little bit about the balance sheet of the government and
Sure.
where things stand and to what extent that is a hindrance or not.
I don't see it. To me, it's not a hindrance at all, Simon. What we are finding, yes, the revenues are there, and they support the government in being able to deal with and provide for all the infrastructure projects that we have that are ongoing. But the beauty of it is we can do it without having to borrow. Mm-hmm. And that is something we have not always enjoyed, that privilege. So everything we are doing now, all the road expansion, the solid waste management system, the mental health facility out in East End. There are many hundreds of millions of dollars of projects that are we're trying to get going or have started that will all be financed out of government's recurrent revenues. So that there is, to me, really is the answer to your question, is that we're doing it without borrowing.
Well, let's talk about that.
Sure.
Because I was at the economic outlook thrown by the chamber, and I know somebody asked the question of why we don't just pay off the debt that we have. I think we have for the airport. Is that right?
Well, you've got the airport, again, was done without borrowing a penny. Mm-hmm. They had their own reserves set aside, and the central government put in another $15 million to it to really give them the ability to go out and do it without having to borrow.
So it's a very conservative tactic, I guess, the government is taking, and definitely not what the rest of the world is taking. And
Sure.
in a world where you have LIBOR, you have prime, really at absolutely base floor prices, you have negative interest rates around the world. Why, in a situation where we do have growing revenues of over 15%, will we not look to pay for some of those infrastructure projects with money that is almost free?
So borrow more, you're saying?
It never remains that way. And your revenues just don't grow linearly forever.
Oh, of course not.
They contract. And, that was the situation we found ourselves in during the times of the Great Recession, where, revenues fell off the cliff. We had repayment obligations. And, that was one of the reasons we had to consolidate debt in 2009 and go and issue that $312 million bond that matures at the end of the month. And again, in 2012, the government of the day at that time had to institute some very significant revenue-raising measures at what I would argue is the worst possible time, when you were trying to generate economic activity and try to get development going again. Government was having to go and tax the people and take money out of the economy just to meet its bills. To me, I would love to see this country completely without debt. If I had my way, that would be the first order of priority, because it frees a government and gives a government so much more flexibility to do the things that it would like to do without the specter of debt hanging over you. Yes, it's cheap, but it has its own knock-on effects.
Well, let me ask you on that, because I think I'm going to say this slightly in jest, but it's the sense I got almost there was that were we to experience a downturn or a slowdown, if the government has a very low level of debt, in the past we had an experience like that and we had to borrow money at the wrong time, or we had to borrow money and we had to raise revenue, which helped slow down the economy even further. Yeah. It's like an extra tax on people's spending.
Sure.
That means that we could conceptually, in a slowdown, actually use debt to help reduce taxes on people, import duties and costs and such like.
You have that flexibility, Simon. That's what that brings to the occasion.
I thought I was going to get a promise from the minister there to spend money.
But also remember, too, as a government, we have built up substantial
Sure.
reserves. So we've got, well in excess. The law requires us to have 90 days of cash in reserves for that purpose. So what that does is that it builds resilience in government's finances and in the country's ability to weather an economic downturn. And so, again, yes, you got these reserves and you have the flexibility to, if you do need to, go into the market and borrow money to do that, rather than tax your people and take money out of your economy, because that's not what you want to do when you're trying to generate economic growth. You want to put more money into the hands of your private sector to get that engine started.
Oh, for sure. There was a CFA investment forum a couple of weeks ago, and we had the former CFO of Enron on there, and he was well known for off-balance sheet accounting and tricks like that. And most governments have these situations where there are things on their balance sheet and also things off their balance sheet. Now, in Cayman's case, in most governments' case, you have pension liabilities and you have healthcare liabilities. And from my research, the pension liabilities, we actually have a pension surplus in the public sector, which seems quite extraordinary in many respects, that we're one of the only places in the world that actually has a surplus. But there's nothing wrong with that. It's just extraordinary that we've managed to be different to everyone else in the world. So that's good credit. But we do have unfunded liabilities in the healthcare side of things. And that's something that I think is worth being aware of as citizens of this country. And I think they're around about $1.85 billion, if I'm not mistaken.
The last report we had was, I think, 1.6 billion.
So 1.6. Those are big numbers. So that's potentially about 50% of our GDP. So if you add that in terms of the debt that we currently have, we still have actual debt in terms of the government
obligations.
And so that perhaps goes to part of your argument as to why you want to pay down the on-balance sheet debt, because we still have these other matters that we still need to fund.
Absolutely.
So, but then people who are living and retiring, how do you reassure them that those sort of things aren't going to be problems in the future and higher taxes and such like?
You do the things we're doing right now, and that is always running a surplus budget, setting by proper reserves to make sure that when the time comes to pay those obligations, pay those claims, when people do get sick, and that you have the money there to be able to do it. We have always historically, and I think very difficult to find a country that has those kind of reserves set aside. They pay for them out of current revenue. And I would love to be able for us to say we could set aside, funding, resources to pay down those obligations as and when they arrive. The challenge you face here is that you're again taking resources out of government coffers, that you're having them sit there for probably 25, 30 years.
That's sort of like the Norwegian approach, which is what they did with their oil revenue, put some of it into a sovereign fund to help pay for things in the future when times aren't so good.
Yes.
So potentially that's an avenue for us to think about.
It certainly is. And, at the moment, we far exceed the 90-day requirement that the law requires. It's well in excess of that.
Well, we're running a little bit low on time, so I'll give you kind of a last chance. No new borrowing and no raising of fees. What are the priorities for the next year and the next 2 years for the government?
I would say at the top right now, infrastructure development on roads. We've got to come to grips with it. Education continues to be a key priority. Those would be the two big areas. No new taxes, you're right. No new borrowings, except that the bond matures at the end in 3 weeks' time, actually.
And are we going to be refinancing that, or
there's a portion that will be refinanced. We are paying down about a substantial portion of it.
But that's not new borrowing, that's just refinancing of
No, we're just refinancing a bit of it. And, it's unfortunate that, when we took out that bond, we were right in the midst of going into the recession, and government didn't have the resources to set aside the sinking fund. So this is where we find ourselves, that we have to refinance a portion of it.
Probably
in that process
refinancing it lower.
I expect that the rates will be substantially lower than what we were, because, we did that at 6%. So I think it's going to. I'm expecting it to be substantially lower,
which is good for government and the economy. Well, I think I had a list of about 7 or 8 questions I wanted to get through, and I think we're on question 2, and we are already out of time. So if we can beg you to come back perhaps in a few months' time, and we'll rejoin this conversation and talk a little bit more about the economy. But it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed being here. It's been great conversation with you and sharing my thoughts, ideas as well. Yeah. I'm happy to come back anytime.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Minister. And that is Money Sense for today. Please do tune in again in 2 weeks' time. And remember, you can catch highlights, or no, actually not highlights, the actual show on our website, as well as tweet us at Money Sense Radio with any questions, topics, or observations you have for us. Thank you and goodbye.